question to whether African leaders really take the question of climate change seriously. I think that there's a lack of understanding and information about a lot of things that leaders, I think, worldwide, not just Africans, but I think worldwide, do not really understand about climate change itself. And I say this because I remember when we started the WTO struggles, even our negotiators, our trade negotiators, knew very little about the key elements of negotiating an agreement and what was entailed in the sophistry, all the playing with words, etc. And coming there genuinely to the table thinking that, if I come with a good text, it's going to be accepted because, of course, we all believe in human rights, we all believe in all these wonderful things. But you get to the text, and yes, it's a reasonable text, but somebody else has a whole different understanding of that text, and just by adding a different word in that text, it changes the meaning of the entire document. And I think we've not become sophisticated enough in terms of the climate stuff to really understand what drives many of the countries who come to the table. What is their motivation for being there? There may be some African governments who are there because their people genuinely are suffering. They're seeing their crops fail. They're seeing the new health hazards that are emerging in many communities. But perhaps they don't see the opportunistic profiteers who are also at the table, who want different things from that table, and often coerce people around the table, as you've shown so well, to say, look, we can help you mitigate, take a few $1 million to sort of solve this problem, to let the problem go away, and you shut up about it and go solve your problems locally. This is really not your issue. This is really a Chinese issue. So there are all sorts of boogie issues that are brought into the discourse that obfuscate the real issues. In a climate where you have a continent where climate issues themselves are not talked about at a technical level, I think we talk about climate issues properly in the sense that you see your crops dying. When you escalate that to the negotiating table, we're not talking like that. There's all this technical language now that confuses issues. And I don't think that we've grasped that as African leaders to say, actually, no, that's not the issue. This is the real issue. This is what we should be talking about. You need a groundswell of civil society to consistently put these issues, I think, on the table in ways in which people can understand until they become a mantra, in the same way that we did with WTO issues, and our leaders started to get the point. So I think, again, in Africa, issues of environment, issues of climate justice, have been, those are North issues, those are Western issues. Who talks about the environment? We're not environmentalists. That's stuff rich white people do. So, and I think we've got to demystify that as well and begin to really bring the issues down. I'm excited about the groundswell of young youth at university level, on the streets, in the social movements, who are understanding these, because these things are in their face, but they're talking about it from their own experiences, and that makes sense. And I think that's what we need more of, and that should enter the official spaces as well.
I think that's amazing, because so many of the points you're making remind me that after the kind of pressure you put, even starting in November 30, 1999, a week later, the payoff was the African ministers walked out of Seattle WTO and basically destroyed the Bill Clinton Millennium development round, Millennium trade round that they were going to do in Seattle. I mean, that was African ministers with lots of pressure and some very good surgical work by civil society, CTini, and it was a great experience. It was repeated, of course, 2003, when there was huge protest outside, and 30,000 in Cancun, and African ministers again. In 2001, it was interesting because African ministers said, look, we really need at least one thing to take away, and that's like AIDS medicines. Give us an exemption from trips. So we didn't have protesters in Doha. Some of you watching the World Cup in 2022 will understand why. But you know, it's a very difficult place to. Maybe there's going to have a revolution there next week. We don't know. But I think the main point is that when African negotiators' spines needed to be stiffened, and there were the civil society pressure points so well directed, we achieved amazing results, like stopping the WTO in its tracks. There was a sense that the late, great Dennis Brutus, this wonderful poet who was our inspiration in so many ways, and he was in our center the last 5 years of his life. Before he died, which was in December 2009, he kept saying, Seattle, Copenhagen. And they're not two cities, one's become a verb. So that's really what needs to happen to Copenhagen, is that same configuration of insiders, African elites, walking away when the deal's no good. Now we thought, at that point, Dennis and everyone were saying, oh, Mr. Zenawi, he sounds pretty militant. He had a practice walkout in Barcelona in November 2009 at one of the preparatory committees of the Copenhagen summit. And he was making these great demands, like, you know, big climate death, and we've got to stop the emission. He was sounding pretty good for a little while. He went to Copenhagen via Paris, and Sarkozy did something to U-turn him, and Paksha just said, now Zenawi is not an ally. He's gone over the other side, the dark side. He's not going to come into alignment with us, and that's one of the tragedies. But it's not just a few, you know, African elites who sell out. Even the Maldives, those great guys, $50 million. That's not much for a sunken country. It's the entire world elites, national and global. Because one man, above all, I think knows this. He was Pablo Solon, the negotiator from Bolivia, tried his best every step of the way to get climate justice in that CJ meetings, ideas in. And every step of the way he was disregarded, and his attempt to even block consensus just unprocedurally ignored. And he thought he would even have our friends of the left in Venezuela and Cuba and Nicaragua joining him, but for some reason, some power relation changed that. This guy was alone. So he's come back. He was in Dakar meeting lots of WSF social movements, and he said, look, we learned from that in this balance of forces now, you in civil society have to pick up this process. And you have to make, and it's exactly what you said. What I think which Obama failed to do is your last point, that there's a youth, there's a generational climate debt, there's a youth project that has only begun to flower. And in Canada, you've got a very strong youth network that I hope is going to help lead the world on that. But it is really time for our kids to ask us, why are we flying around so much? But to really put this as a generational debt. And that's partly the north-south debt, but we really have to factor in the potential militance of youth. And for some of you who don't know militant youth, because you're in Canada with a nice, safe welfare state, I know there's some fantastic militant youth out a couple of hours ago saying that the trustees of Carleton have to sell their stocks in military. That's fantastic. But think of the British youth, right? Sitting there in their comfort of their nice homes watching cynical British sitcoms and playing computer games. Wow, it didn't take that long for them to start one of the most formidable movements against austerity that I could imagine. I mean, it's like October, November they got started, and they just had 500,000 people out on Saturday. So things will really come up from nowhere, and in places you might least expect it. And certainly, we traditionally will hope that these pick up the better. We're good.